Hey guys, welcome back. I'm really excited here to be bringing on my old friend Zach. He used to go by Zach Sebastian. It's Zac Waldman now, which I think is great. I guess you became more comfortable not using a pseudonym or something.
I did that Jewish thing where you go into entertainment and all of a sudden your name forms a more like palatable um, kind of construct. And then you get older. I was really like I turned 30 and I was like, I'm not gonna like give my kids this name. And then I was like, well, I feel kind of like a ridiculous human being. But when I started it, I was 19 and I was doing a party with a girl named Haley Hot Pink. And she was like, I already know one Zach. She's like, you need a name. And I was like, think Zach Sebastian sounds nice. And it actually, not that it's a big deal, but a little thing on like networking and whatever is like saying your full name to people is actually very effective in having them memorize it and remember you. And having a full name that is memorable is even more memorable. So I have to say it. I think it worked for the 10 years or so I was a photographer.
It's a lot better than giving your kids a real weird first name like a Blanket or a Trapezoid or something like that.
Yeah, I think like there's enough weirdness that goes on with last names that you go like nice and awesome for first names. First names are hard to get rid of. Last names you can marry out of, you can kind of drop. Your first name, it's like be nice to your kids.
Absolutely.
So Zach has a number of roles. He's now an adjunct professor at Parsons.
Parsons. Yeah.
And Zach's a longtime New York City photographer, photographing a lot of events, noteworthy individuals, did a lot of nightlife, and you still work at Millennial, don't you?
I do. I work with Millennial. So Millennial is owned by my like closest, oldest friend. And so I will always work in some way, in tangent with him, but no, not officially. I'm focusing on teaching and writing and some kind of digital consulting along the way. But yeah.
Zach and I met years ago through mutual friends, and then Zach invited me to participate in his Futurist Sessions. I had a couple of opportunities to speak there. I invited Zoltan Ishvan there, and that was what introduced. So Grace Scott came to one of those events, and that's what got my foot in the door so I could write for his blog. And the time I spoke, David Yaris was there and Steve Dean was there. And Steve Dean had a meetup, which is where I met Lev.
Oh, that's crazy.
And the only reason why I met Steve Dean was I was doing this thing called the Hamsterization Project, where I was drawing people as hamsters based on this animated short I did for this dude named Colin Huggins, who plays the piano in Washington Square Park. So to make a long story short, Steve Dean saw that I was doing this hamsterization thing. He wanted me to draw him as a hamster, so he invited me to this event, and that's where I met Jules, and the rest is history.
I love that. It's just many years in nightlife, but I can look back at the genesis of a lot of like partnerships and things like that I just happened to be either party to or kind of part of, and it's really it's strange. It's the outlier effect, right? And it's like you never know who's going to connect you with who and when and what that's going to mean for your like whole life path.
Well, I don't know how much you believe in something like there was that DVD series that came out many years ago called The Secret. Then there were things related to the power of attraction, but just the idea that you would attract certain people to you based on certain desires that you may have. And I don't know how much of it we're in control on, how much of it is just us being on rails in this destined type of existence where certain things are predetermined, or how much is it that I decide, you know what, I'm going to get to know all the people who are in this futurist thing, who are going to be changing the world. And by happenstance, I happen to be introduced to them, not so much by sitting down and having to contact every single one of them, but a lot of this just feels sometimes a little bit too easy. I don't know. Do you ever get that impression?
So I do a lot of thinking about this this particular thing. So let me tell you what my base belief on the universe is, and I've come to some pretty like basic conclusions about this. But so there's a professor at Harvard named Alex Wisner Gross, and he recently released a TED Talk where he defines what he believes to be the equation for the force of intelligence. Which I think you could like interspace with like the force of consciousness, and so it really is a consciousness discussion. And he's an economist, so he doesn't really actually see it so much in its philosophical tie-ins. But essentially, what he says is that the definition of intelligence is maximizing your future options. And I personally believe that I'm kind of pantheist in my beliefs, and I believe that quantum particles, whatever are kind of the most basic pixel of our universe, and I believe those to be quantum particles probably, are conscious in that way. That is the base level of consciousness, which is that everything is trying to maximize its future options. And so, it's hard to kind of find how, your meetup with Lev is translated by some movements on the quantum level, but surely, you could say that, this question of how we went from, sulfur vents at the bottom of a newly formed ocean on a newly formed planet with no life on it to this conversation that we're having right now. And I think that you have to ascribe some sense of direction and force of direction to that kind of phenomenon. And I think that does a lot for us. I think that it doesn't, because I'm actually a simulist, and we can talk about this more. So my full belief is that whatever it is that we're in right now is most likely a simulation, and that there are theological ramifications because of that belief. But I think, in terms of like how the actual machinations of the universe and how things like The Secret and the laws of attraction work, it's like if I am made up of a coalition of different quantum particles that have all had history throughout the universe, they've literally been there since the beginning of the universe, and they have a universe long 13.8 billion, as far as we can tell, like long history, that their ability to recognize quantum particles that they've shared part of that journey with at some point of the journey, right? Like there's all sorts of interconnections. And that if you just ascribe some sort of consciousness to a more base level, then you start to be like, well, it's kind of like, you go through life, and like sometimes you're in one company like Millennial, and then sometimes you're in another company. But sometimes, like while you're at the new company in Parsons, a buddy named Lev calls you up, and you know him from something else, and it's like yeah, the whole world is interconnected, but it's interconnected on such a more basic level that this kind of invisible force that we ascribe to attraction or some sort of a telepathy thing is just, it seems natural to the way life has built itself. Anyway, that was a
that is really fascinating. Would you also add to that a certain idea, which I don't know if there's a name for it, but it's this idea that I've been having, that every single thing we're experiencing, including whenever you stub your toe or wherever you have a fight with somebody, that is a lesson that's given to you in order for you to then learn something from it. So this whole experience, even the fact that we have no idea whether there are aliens out there, or whether there is a god or gods, or whether there are higher beings out there that play some kind of role. Just that idea of us not knowing it is also, in a way, a certain lesson to give us more of a choice. Like if we knew that reincarnation exists or there's an afterlife, it wouldn't have the same effect as being in this really unsure type of environment where you have no idea what's going to happen when you die.
Of course, some people don't believe that. They don't believe that they're unsure. They believe that they're totally sure and that it is reincarnation, or they're totally sure and it's the end of it, or they're totally sure it's, people have all their different things. But I think you're totally right, which is that, it's all, at the very least, you have to see it as a lesson. So what I like, my original piece on simulism is basically this. If you woke up tomorrow and you were in a video game, right? If you woke up and you like looked at your like self and you were all animated and you saw like everything else was shimmering and it was like mid 90s, like, you know, animation, you were like, holy shit, like I'm in a video game. You would only really be able to discern from that moment two things. The first would be don't die. And the second would be like, there's probably a point, like there's probably a quest or like a goal or like a winnable character. Like there's a point to you being animated and having choice. It's not just that you're animated, it's that you have awareness and that you have choice. So you're looking around and you're like, wow, I'm in a room looking around.
Purpose. You have a purpose in the video game.
You have purpose in the video game. And thus, in life, if we were to believe that we were in a simulation, you can do those same two things. One, don't die. And two, you probably have a purpose. And if you probably have a purpose and you see yourself in this video game of life, then everything, you're right, everything that happens to you has something to teach you, right? Some of it like, more important than others, right? Like some things are like super, yeah.
Well, two things. I love thinking about the idea of, you know, you either probably have a purpose or like people, you have to give yourself a purpose. And some people find their purpose from external sources because they're inspired. But some people through introspection, you know, like find their own meaning. I'm not very fond of that language. I think that like meaning is inherent in life. So even though meaning is a human construct, it's a tool we invented to describe objective reality, whatever this reality is. So even if humans didn't exist, you could say meaning wouldn't exist, but objective reality would still exist. So I feel that things that are meant to be are things that we create. And so I think it's important because a lot of people sometimes get lost thinking that things are inherently meaningless, which I disagree with. And I think people on that track sometimes find themselves thinking they're purposeless or they don't have a purpose, or they'll ask themselves misconceived questions like, why am I here? Which presupposes a why when really it just is.
I think you're right. I think it kind of depends on what you're trying to get to, right? And if you're trying to get to kind of a sound philosophical framework to kind of intellectualize the world around you, then I agree. If you're trying to either get people to move or yourself to move, it is sometimes even like, you know, like why do people give themselves goals when they go to, you know, it's a meaningless construct to be like, I want to be X pounds, or like, I want to be able to bench press X, right? But like if you don't set those goals, if you don't kind of set that purpose, which maybe is kind of what you're saying, right? Which is that you set those purposes and you set those goals, but also not setting goals like has the unfortunate side effect sometimes of meaning that you go nowhere and you do nothing. And setting up frameworks and believing in them and keeping to them oftentimes at the very least means you make progress in a certain direction. So while you're right that like you don't have to wake up and say I have meaning, like I don't understand the point of doing it unless you're just trying to like, I mean, I think that's what you said, is that you don't like meaningless. You don't like when somebody says life is meaningless.
Well, I find that conversations that discuss meaning sometimes create language traps for people. So I think some ideas can be corrosive to mental machinery, and I think some ideas are more conducive to thriving, mental well-being. If someone commits suicide, it's because their mental machinery has malfunctioned, right? And so I think mental health is really important. And I think a lot of people understand religion as a thought technology to elevate their conscious well-being. And I think a lot of religious people look at atheists or agnostics as somehow having or embodying this void. How could they be elevating their consciousness if they're not sufficiently answering questions that people who are religious find answers in religion. Do you know what I mean?
I mean,
I feel like for people to say that science can replace religion, it's almost like a religion itself. Like, I think a lot of people are very wise to point out scientism. People can have a faith in science and misunderstand it as a process, right? And so I feel like that's where we are in culture right now, is that religion is becoming more secular and decentralized, as it's been for a very long time, and science is making breakthroughs at a pace that's never been recorded before, and people are grappling with how can these things be compatible and complement each other to help everyone thrive and make the world a better place.
I think they will. My feeling on religion simply is that religion is tradition plus community around some kind of formalized set of philosophy, whatever that is, and so we tend to ascribe cult status to certain things that could be a religion, and religion to certain things that could be cults, and we ascribe neither of the two to things that could definitely be a religion if you take that definition. So this idea of like, what is a religion other than like kind of the old schools of thoughts that have survived for thousands and thousands of years to teach us certain things. I think that they all had in mind some higher level of consciousness and higher level of meaning. And I think that when you strive for that, you get closer than not to the mark, right? And so, yeah.
Well, something that I see in Christianity, as well as parts of Hinduism and the Kabbalah as well, which I've been getting into quite recently, is the idea that the end goal, so to speak, isn't merely for people to just chase their fancies in, as the Hindu religion calls Maya, the illusion that we're in, that's a never-ending cycle of birth and death. But the end goal in this case would be the merging of all of us with the Godhead from which we all descended. Or in the Kabbalah, they have an expression called the breaking of the vessels, where the originating force that created everything, once it created everything, Ein Sof, as they call it, the world of infinity, it was a force that was given all of that Godhead's love, or how do I say it? It was a vessel that received, and that force, which we could call God, was something that gave it something. It was an all-giving force, and that vessel that received that force was so happy and so gratified to get it. But eventually, and I'm not really sure what the middle steps are here because I haven't gotten into it that much, but eventually the level that we're at right now is one where we're always receiving and not giving back. Even if we're giving back something, like if we're showing love to somebody, if we have a family, wife and kids, we're still getting something out of showing love towards those people. We're still getting the satisfaction of being, a family man, of being somebody who helps other people out. And in the Kabbalah, the goal is, from what I understand, to elevate oneself in terms of the state of mind to being able to give without wanting anything in return. And that would be the state of the creator. And as far as Hinduism goes, the thing there is to sit around, meditate, and eventually get to the point of samadhi where you're merging together with universal consciousness or God or whatever you want to call it. So in two of those things, and I'm sure in certain esoteric sects of Christianity, you would find similar things. The idea would be to have everybody go together as the one unit that we were all once a part of, as opposed to living in this world where it's dualistic, where there's you and me, there's the observer and the observed.
So there's a Buddhist concept that fits perfectly with that. This idea of how the world. So originally you have kind of nothingness, right? Mm-hmm. And from that nothingness, kind of step down. Like it had to, in order to get to creation, from nothingness came soul, and from soul came mind, and mind like stepped itself down to body, and body stepped itself down to matter. And then as we know it, right, like the beginning of the universe was this explosion of matter outward, which has slowly like formed into bodies, which like then through a long process, developed minds, which has kind of like now started to, use its soul to ask these questions of like, how are we reconnecting back at the beginning, right? How do we get back to that place that and it's like, you had to get that, right? Like you had to get there. We had to get up to this mind and soul construct in order to get to, and where we could even scratch the surface of like what that next level is, what it means to be part of the whole thing. You should check out Neoplatonism, specifically Platonius, who was one of the kind of star students of Plato, went on to write a whole bunch that kind of became the basis philosophy-wise for a lot of the things that you're talking about, Vedantic Hinduism, Kabbalah. There's even, kind of the early Gnostics who were like kind of combined with the Christians, the early Christians had a lot of that.
Absolutely.
And what's really interesting that he says, and I think that this is a point, because you mentioned God, I think this is a point that people kind of rush over a lot of the time, which is when we say God, we mean two things. One, the creator of us. And the second thing is with the creator of everything. And it is seemingly like we do it all the time in like, just like kind of like, I don't know, like seasoned philosophers will be like God and only refer to the combination of those two things, like they have to be combined, like whatever created us. And I guess you could say that the original creator, whatever created everything, is in a sense the creator of us. But could we have a more direct creator? Is it fair to believe that like that something potentially came between the first emanation of soul or whatever existed before existence, and whoever kind of like did the lowly job of forming our atoms together? And it's like we often put those two things together. I think that's kind of something at least to be discussed. And Platonius says it. I mean, he actually calls that mid-level god creator the demiurge, which is a craftsman or artisan god in Greek. And yeah, so I like to think that we have a creator, and that the story before that is a much crazier and metaphysical story, but that we can actually look at our own creation tale and our potential future creation tales where we create simulations and continue on with the cycle as part of that.
Well, in ancient Greece, it was Prometheus who was considered to be the creator of mankind, and Zeus got real mad at him for elevating humans to a higher status. So Zeus made them stupid. Then Prometheus Prometheus stole the fire of the gods, gave them to human beings. And from what I understand, that's supposed to be the analogy of human beings having this ability to create technology and to elevate themselves above just hanging around in the trees.
It's a pretty awesome thing when you think about it. Again, to especially to think that we actually came from hanging around in trees. We are that. So my feeling on evolution is really simple. If you look at humans, right, like so is above, so is below. So I expect quantum particles to act just like humans, right? And so you've got a bunch of quantum particles, and they're sulfur, right, for a really long time. And most of them are going to do sulfur because their parents did sulfur and their parents did sulfur, and everyone's going to do sulfur, except along comes some crazy quantum particle that's like, you know what, fuck this. I'm going to move about my own. I don't want to be around this vent thing anymore. I want to go do my own thing. I'm going to become my own single-celled organism, right? And then you get a whole bunch of stuff, because that becomes the trend for a long time. And then single-celled organisms are a thing, and then there's like just that one single-celled organism is like, fuck this. My buddy and I over here, we could do much better if we were together all the time. We're going to do this thing. And then, and so you get this almost, it feels like a spiritual gravity that has pulled us from nothingness to this conversation right now. But my real belief that it is thought and action on the periphery, on the cutting edge. It is these conversations that actually are the force of evolution. They are the force of evolution, whether it's, a llama or a horse straining its neck and being like, I really, 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 really would like to have that leaf up there on the tree. And like, I just can't, it's not working out. And then he's like, he tells his kid, I just only wish. And then weird enough, like third generation, some like taller necked, like horse arrives. And you're like, and again, traditional evolutionary theory says that was a mutation, a random mutation that happened randomly And that it just so happened to be that the one randomized horse with a slightly longer neck found the other randomized horse with the slightly longer neck, and that they fucked and created another, which then met another weird product of slightly longer necks. It's like, it's outrageous to believe that evolution could have happened the way that we say it happened without there being some underlying force pushing us forward towards whatever it is that we desire. And that is why we see things come true.
I kind of see things almost as a breath, where even in Hinduism they refer to the universe as Brahma's breath. Brahma breathes the universe out and then breathes it back in. But there's this idea that I think was published recently about how there are things that are occurring in the future that are calling us into it, as if there are attractors from something that is yet to happen that lead us into a certain path. And I can imagine that being like the breath being taken in again. And what happens when all of this matter goes in through the nostrils of God, or whatever you want to call it, everything is merged again. And probably what happens after that is everything goes out, everything goes in, everything goes out, and it just keeps going, like a cycle within the larger cycle within the larger cycle.
Well, I imagine there's a foam of universes. So the Big Bang could be one of many origin stories. And it's sort of the horizon of what we can, I guess you could say what we could know, or what we can theorize, responsibly theorize. I don't know. It depends. I don't want to get too lost in the language, but if we're using a quantum perspective, I like you said, the irreducible unit of existence is a quantum particle. I learned from James Gleick that the irreducible unit of nature is information, and that would certainly apply to quantum particles. That if everything is in some form information, that's its most irreducible form, because no matter how much you reduce, it's always information. And I think that's a very interesting perspective. I feel like that's what would you say? That's of the zeitgeist. That's the edge of the world's knowledge. That's what I've been able to find, and I identify as a seeker of truth. So I'm not interested in arriving at truth, because I feel like that's when you've stopped thinking. I'm interested in searching for the truth, in, being a skeptic of the world and of myself. And I know that I'm fallible, and I see a scientific perspective means prioritizing error detection and self-correction. And I feel like that has given me a lot of joy and curiosity. And I feel like it reminds me of the movie Interstellar, when they're showing everybody in this environmentally wrought planet, and everybody's looking in the dirt, and everyone's forgotten how to even look at the stars. They've lost their optimism. And it's a film about the human spirit rising to save each other, because that's what people do. We solve problems and then find new problems to solve.
Yeah, we always, that is, I guess, our quest, right? Our quest is always to find problems, and it almost seems like if we have to make them, we will do that. But I like the idea. It goes back to what I was saying about the two things, because this is what I believe to be the theological implications of a belief in simulism, which is that if you believe that if we are most likely simulated, then you can go to that, the two things, stay alive and find your purpose. And then my first step towards finding the purpose, actually the first step is don't die. And the don't die thing is, for the first time, something that we as humans are kind of grappling with on a different level, at a different level of stakes, right? We could have always kind of died off by meteorite or plague. That could have always happened. But we've now gotten to the point where it could be by our own hands. And which is interesting. You mentioned suicide earlier. So this idea of broken mental machinery, I'm sure a lot of people would say that our societal mental machinery has potentially been broken a little bit. And we're going a little nuts right now. But so step one, so first lesson upon this new belief is don't die, which means, like, as a collective, as a unit, as an organism, as a greater organism, this human organism, don't die.
Rage against the dying of the light.
Rage against the dying of the lights. And I think that there's never been a way for us to collectivize ourselves towards that goal on a human scale before. There's been like, we are, an identity, and so we don't want to perish. And so we kind of form together in our little sub unit and fight against our own specific deaths. But when we as a human species come together and realize that we are in peril, then I think that might be the thing that allows us to kind of transform into a more powerful, and that may be where a lot of evolution comes from. If you think about evolution, doesn't always come from something that you want that's good. It often comes from a way to escape things that are bad. And if we collectively evolve by trying to escape this kind of terrible instinct that we have to kill ourselves off, I think that would be super awesome, and worth a religion is what I
love that.
Well, it definitely feels like we are coming to a head of some kind of a really big challenge that we're all going to have to face as humanity. It reminds me a little bit of the stories of the flood that were not only in the Bible, the Old Testament, but also in other cultures as well. Like, I believe pretty much every single culture has some kind of a flood myth having to do with there being this giant cataclysm, many people dying, but then there's survivors being left over to start anew. And there are folks out there like Graham Hancock. Have you heard of him?
I haven't. No, but point me in his direction.
So Graham Hancock is an interesting guy. He's a bit of a rebel when it comes to the mainstream archaeologist community. And he talks about how around 12,000 years ago, there was a giant cataclysm that wiped out a lot of the ancient civilizations. And the survivors had to start afresh. And they were the ones who brought the knowledge that they had to the earliest civilizations that we know of, which, from what I understand, popped out pretty quickly. Like, you don't really see a transitionary phase in ancient Egypt, let's say from more primitive looking hieroglyphics to the hieroglyphics of the Old Kingdom. It was pretty much great when it first started, and then the Middle Kingdom, it kind of went downhill a little bit. But then in the New Kingdom, it started back up. But the other one would be the Sumerians. Like, they had the system of laws, they had their architecture, those little stamps that they put in with those giant people that some people refer to as the Anunnaki, and supposedly some people think they're aliens. But according to folks like Graham Hancock, a lot of these legends of the fish people and bird people giving people technology is basically the survivors, those who had to store this information of whatever they developed in the past, and then they had to give it to the people who were left over so they could have a fresh go at it. And
Graham Hancock, he had a band, TED Talks. It was about psychedelics.
That's right. It was the
potentially seen that, the band TED Talk one, but yeah, go.
And he talks about ancient aliens. Does Graham Hancock believe that
no,
life was impregnated with aliens impregnated the Earth? Is that what Graham Hancock?
That I don't know about the impregnation. He does not believe that
the aliens. Of the film Prometheus with that alien film, Ridley Scott.
The end of Prometheus is a really interesting. I mean, I think that. So first off, I believe that I think there is just an indisputable amount of evidence that we are not alone. To this point now where it almost seems laughable that we haven't taken it seriously as a culture, because we just have so much, and I guess we're just so used to thinking of aliens as this thing that are gonna have to show up on our doorstep and lower their ramp down for us to take it seriously. But I don't understand. I don't understand how. I mean, you can look it up, and especially now that we've got camera phones and stuff like that, people are capturing cell phone footage of stuff like this, almost daily, all around the world. Mm-hmm. And we've been doing it for decades upon decades. We have, we have that. It was just a New York Times front cover thing where they had the 25-year Navy vet who flew an F-18 right off the coast, and he's got a video of it, and it's front page that the Pentagon had an entire thing. It's we're way past this, and I don't know if you guys have read the 37th Parallel.
Mm-mm.
No.
Okay. You should absolutely. So it's Ben Mesrick, and Ben Mesrick wrote The Social Network, and he wrote what was called Bringing Down the House, which became the movie 21. So he writes really crazy nonfiction stories, and he writes this book called The 37th Parallel, and he's got a TED Talk on it. You should look it up; it's really interesting. And it's about this like alien hunter guy, right? But he goes through and he like like tells you a whole bunch of stories, like the story behind Roswell, and this guy's super interested in cattle mutilations. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cattle
The ones
mutilations.
that are really clean. Nobody knows exactly how they were able to do them so cleanly. And
No
so many.
blood. Yeah, super like surgical incisions, all the organs missing, tongue missing, eye missing, and no blood anywhere on the scene or anywhere in the body of these cows. And it's over 10,000 times it's happened in the Midwest and in the South. So much so that in the 70s, 3 governors called together the like a quorum to like push the federal government to investigate. Then they investigated for 10 years and didn't find a single thing. Didn't find a footprint or a fingerprint or anything on like it's so
Whoa.
so he goes through this whole thing. So at the very end of it, the basic idea is that at the end of this thing, he sees this report for this earthquake that happened in 2014 in Virginia, and I'm from Virginia, so I remember when this happened because earthquakes don't happen in Virginia. And so to like hear about a pretty big earthquake that happened in Southern Virginia is like a pretty big deal. And my parents were in Virginia, so I remember that. And then he looked, and it was like the next day there was an earthquake in California, in an area that doesn't normally have earthquakes. And he looked, and on the map they were both on the same longitude line. And then when he looked further, it turns out that not only was that on the same longitude line, but so was Roswell and Area 51 and Fort Knox and the Pentagon and every underground base we have. Every major occurrence of cattle mutilations have essentially occurred across this line. And the front cover of the book is this photo with all of these dots. There's a picture of America with all these dots. And so I remember, I watched this TED Talk, and I was like, holy shit, that's crazy. And then I had a thought, because I hadn't thought about it for a really long time. But when I was really young, my dad was running for Congress in West Virginia, and we have a 200-acre farm in West Virginia. And in 1992, I guess, my mother was sitting with her father, who's a retired Navy captain, and they were looking out the front of our farm over the hill. And my mom saw a UFO, like a full-on, like super bright circle. That was like, she said, would have been the size of like our small like horse barn thing. And it was just floating super softly above the tree line, and then went behind our tree thing. So I hadn't thought about this story kind of my whole life, because it was like a total blip. My mom is like doesn't do drugs, doesn't drink. She's like a total, like, my parents are generally Republican. Like these are not people who are like, oh man, I like, they're not people that, and my grandfather even crazier, like the most conservative old man ever. So for him to have like seen it as well, like these people were not lying. And so, but I didn't think about it until I see this TED Talk. And in TED Talk, I saw this a year and a half ago. And I look up, and I look up on Google Maps where my farm is. And my farm is on the 37th parallel. It is on.
This is very interesting. This is very interesting.
They seem to be very polite to keep whatever they're doing to this 37th parallel and not deviate from that. Maybe they struck some kind of deal where you just keep on this lane and no more.
Well, so that's the hypothesis is that it's an underground alien superhighway, and that where we see them tends to be like off ramps. But that obviously it would be safer for them to travel like underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while they got to come out, and where they come out along this 37th parallel is places we tend to see them, or that we've had like higher end activity.
Well, that
reminds me of the Steven Spielberg War of the Worlds, right? They're all underground, and then they start coming up.
There's so much. Have you heard of it? Like we have like a whole ocean way underneath us that's bigger than our ocean.
Well, I was just about to talk about the theory of the inner Earth and Admiral Byrd and Operation High Jump. I don't know how familiar you are with these 3 things I mentioned right now.
Those last ones not, but inner Earth, continue.
Okay, so there is this dude named Admiral Byrd who had to do a mission to Antarctica in order to, as they said, it was just an exploratory mission, but according to his diary, they were basically fighting the Nazis who had these UFOs that they were shooting laser beams at and crazy stuff like that. So anyway, the Nazis totally beat their asses. They had to retreat, and this was around the time that the Foo Fighters made national coverage flying over the White House. And those, according to Admiral Byrd, were supposed to be the same UFOs that the Germans made. But the Germans didn't just make them alone. They had help from this chick named Marissa Orsic, who was a psychic, who got them connected with these extraterrestrials who lived in Antarctica. To make a long story short, the Nazis supposedly fled to Antarctica and went deep underground, not only established bases there, but they had areas that they lived in inside of the earth. And this is the craziest part of all. I have no idea if this is true or not. This requires so much knowledge of geology in order to even qualify this as being serious. But anyway, according to this inner earth theory, we are living on the outside, but there is an inner earth where it is, how do you say it? Like we're concave and it's convex. I'm not sure if I'm using the right terminology here.
Yeah,
but
it's convex, they would be concave.
They would be concave. They have this smoky red star that is responsible for the light and the heat. And, well, I guess that means that they don't really have a nighttime, kind of like in Alaska at certain times of the year. It probably sucks. But anyway, they wrote interesting things about these inner civilizations there and how they're really peaceful and they have super advanced technology and how that's where the UFOs come out of, where it's not that the UFOs come out of the sky as we suppose. They actually come from the underground. Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting that what you said right now, it made me think of those inner civilizations. Whether there's any truth to it or not, I don't know. But so far, from what I understand, it's not that easy to actually go to Antarctica or the Arctic, nor to go into the very center of it. So something feels fishy.
We know a number of people. Well, I know a number of people that have been to Antarctica. Gray Scott went on an expedition out there. Lev was in contact with some Antarctic scientists who have access to the satellites over there. My former business partner, Max Gwen, went on an expedition to Antarctica. Who else?
So I'm here to talk with Yuval and Tristan. Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Good to be here.
Tristan, why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do, and then Yuval, you tell me too.
Mm-hmm. I am a director of the Center for Humane Technology, where we focus on realigning technology with a clear-eyed model of human nature. And I was, before that, a design ethicist at Google, where I studied the ethics of human persuasion.
I'm a historian, and I try to understand where humanity is coming from and where we are heading.
Let's start by hearing about how you guys met each other, because I know it goes back a little while. So when did the two of you first meet?
Funnily enough, on an expedition to Antarctica.
Those are the people that I know.
But
and
it's true though that you essentially can only go to you go to coastal Antarctica. You roll up on penguins and stuff like that. Like Antarctica is fucking massive. You know, like it's really, really, really big. So this idea of like the interior of Antarctica is the equivalent of like we all go and visit Miami and somewhere in like Wisconsin is like, you know, is some crazy shit. But I mean, listen, it totally could be. My general belief though is that like if you believe that aliens exist, right, and you believe that our government has pretty much actively been trying to keep that from us for a long time. And by the way, Hillary Clinton was going to release these documents because her chief of staff, Podesta, is like a big UFO nut and wants all that stuff.
Is he really?
Yeah, he's really into UFOs. So
interesting.
So he was gonna be her chief of staff, and he was really gonna push to get that stuff all. But a whole bunch of them have tried to get it released. There's just no question in my mind that it exists. Then that kind of leads you to then a whole bunch more questions, right? Which is like, hey, maybe we did get a little help in the beginning. Like if they exist, it totally makes sense that at one point they rolled in and were like, you guys are so boring. Like, what is this? You can't even use sticks to make spears yet? Like, what are you guys?
Well, back to what you were talking to earlier about there being middlemen, not exactly God, but in between God and us. I would say not in the center, but even closer to us, there would have been certain beings that could have the ability to intervene. Like I remember reading in the Torah, where they had that story about Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, and then Lot and his daughters had to flee. Well, the way that they were describing that was that there were these people who, the way that they wrote it, it sounded like they were from Star Trek. Like there was the Lord, like here he was, here's God and his several assistants who were telling Lot to get the hell out of there. And then Lot had to flee to this little town, but then afterwards Lot had to flee somewhere to a cave. So that little town wasn't good enough to shield him from whatever it was that led him into that cave afterwards. And that to me sounds like radiation poisoning. So maybe that's what ended up killing his wife. And we have that whole thing with the pillar of smoke in the daytime and pillar of fire in the nighttime that the Hebrews followed as they were going out of Egypt. Like that sounds an awful lot like a UFO, as well as having something land on the mountain and smoke was bellowing out. Like it all makes sense as far as why wouldn't there be certain advanced civilizations that are way past us to such an extent that they could determine certain courses that Earthlings are going to take, and they could set certain events in motion. Or like with Islam, having Muhammad destroy all of these other forces, even though his forces were down to, like if you compare it, he didn't have as much men as the other folks did. He could have also had some help from some giant UFOs that were shooting laser beams. Why not? We don't know. We didn't live during that time. But I don't think it's that silly to assume that there are certain big forces out there that like nudge us along like some giant Rube Goldberg machine towards a certain conclusion.
Well, hold on. I did not expect this conversation to go in this direction, and I am absolutely loving it. And in case anyone listening thinks we're in some kind of noble lie territory, which we're not, like we're genuinely talking about things that I think sometimes are discouraged in polite society. A lot of scientific discoveries are also made accidentally. So when you talk about hollow Earth and people think it sounds like you're talking about dinosaur-shaped Earth or flat Earth, what you don't realize is like science works by falsification. So if there's some kind of Stargate hidden in Antarctica, or if there's a pathway to inner Earth in Antarctica, or if they're just doing other experiments out there, like making resilient crops, or that's where they're making the Dr. Caligari, Chimera, Pokemon creatures, like being allowed to explore forbidden areas is how you serendipitously make discoveries. So people who try to stigmatize conversations like this or censor conversations like this are really doing a gross misservice on many, many levels. Because not only is this intellectually honest, but it's also how things are discovered. It's how knowledge is verified, confirmed, developed, improved, and it's been so fascinating to me, and I think it's the kind of stuff that's on a lot of people's minds. You know, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I saw on Star Talk, was talking about aliens and how they would work.
What can Drake's equation tell us about aliens?
Oh, so Drake equation was a way to organize our ignorance of the universe when we're trying to figure out if we can communicate with intelligent aliens in space. It's named after Frank Drake. He first wrote this equation. I think it was the late 60s, might have been early 70s. You start out with the number of stars in the galaxy, and then you say, well, what fraction of those have planets? What fraction of those that have planets have life? What fraction of those have intelligent life? What fraction of those have intelligent life with technology? What fraction of those might actually be listening for us at any given moment? You start hacking away at this number, and what's left at the end is an estimate for how many civilizations are out there that you might want to talk to. And each one of these terms is an astrophysical question. Or you can back it up further and say, what is the rate that stars are being born? Because that will tell you how many stars you have to search for. So when you put all these terms together, you get an estimate of how many intelligent civilizations might be out there. And right now, one of my recent books, We actually give the very latest calculation for this, and there's like billions, so we're good.
Do we really want to talk to billions of other people?
Yeah, I don't know if you, or tell them where you live, that would be bad. You don't give strangers who are your own species your email address, much less sending the return address to Earth out to aliens across the galaxy.
Who? Alien stranger danger. Alien stranger danger!
And Chuck, you know what the last term in the Drake equation is? It's how long the intelligent civilization might be around at all. It could be that achieving high intelligence, you now know enough how to render yourself extinct. So just because you became intelligent with technology doesn't mean you will keep that for all the rest of time. Maybe you have an expiration date.
Well, hopefully we don't push that date up further than it has to be. All right, let's move on, Neil.
Bring it on.
Don Rim wants to know this. How likely is the theory of panspermia for the genesis of life on Earth?
It's really good. If you look at microbes, not all microbes, some microbes are just fine in the high radiation, low temperature, dehydrating conditions of space. And we have them here on Earth. And you say, why do you have this ability to resist this? That's not a natural force operating on your evolutionary history here. But you would need that getting through the vacuum of space. Asteroid impacts kick rocks into interplanetary space, and they travel and they land on other planets. There's some number of tonnage of rocks on Earth that actually came from Mars, came from other planets in the solar system. So panspermia is the movement of microbes from one planet to the other in the nooks and crannies of the rocks, especially in the crannies.
Panspermia. The Earth got banged by a comet and impregnated with life. It's beautiful. All right, judging from that reaction, it's time for a break. We'll be back with more Wheel of Science right after this.
And he also casually in Joe Rogan spoke about how we could store things in other dimensions. He was like talking about an equation on the Joe Rogan Experience and said, you know, the reason why we don't need flying cars is because we have highways, and it would be much better to store things in other dimensions. And I can pull up this clip and show it to you guys. And it struck me as very weird. And on a different Star Talk episode, he spoke about if we were able to access other dimensions, you'd be able to do things like perform surgery without ever breaking the skin.
How do we know higher dimensions exist? If they do exist, how many may there be?
We do not know for sure if higher dimensions exist. But what we do know is mathematically, we can describe in complete detail zero-dimensional space, one-dimensional space, two-dimensional space, three-dimensional space, that's the space we live in, four-dimensional space, that's the space-time in which we live, and mathematically just add a dimension to get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the math takes us there, and so too then does our imagination.
So, since the math can accurately model the 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 dimensions, does that mean that it's equally as accurate for dimensions 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and on?
One of the great features of mathematical models of reality is that when you manipulate the math, in a way, you're manipulating your understanding of reality. And if a math can make a prediction, if a new equation makes a prediction, and if a prediction is based on an idea that is fundamentally true, then there's a good chance that prediction can be verified by experiment. So we don't yet know how to access other dimensions, but the day that happens, we just invoke the math, and these higher dimensions might even seem familiar to people who have studied the math that got us there.
Oh man, so I'm gonna call my travel agent and my math teacher. All right, Neil, you ready for another question?
Ready for another question. Spin that wheel.
Okay, Alex Reynoso says this. Can a creature from a higher dimension interact with us in our dimension?
Great question. If a higher dimensional creature interacted with us, it would manifest in highly peculiar ways. Think about it. If we are ants on a sheet of paper, living only within that two-dimensional flat world, and we take a sphere and pass it through that sheet of paper, what would that look like to the ant? The ant would say, oh, wait a minute, there's a dot. Oh, the dot just became a circle, a small circle. Oh, the circle's growing. Oh my gosh, oh, it got to a maximum size. Oh, now the circle's shrinking. Oh, it's a dot again. It disappeared. Oh my gosh. That's how an ant would describe us passing a hollow sphere through the ant's universe, two-dimensional universe. So there would be things happening in our space-time that would defy common sense. And we would just describe things popping in and out of existence and behaving in ways that we don't completely understand, even if we can accurately describe it. Yet to a higher dimensional being, it's clear and obvious what's going on.
So 4D would totally change alien probing, if you know what I mean.
It turns out that if you look at a two-dimensional creature and they're purely two dimensions, that means their skin is just a line outlining their innards. So from a three-dimensional view, you can see their entire inner structure. To a higher dimensional being than us, they can see entirely inside of our bodies. And so if they wanted to operate, they wouldn't have to open up our skin, they just go straight in, accessing it from a higher dimension. Once your appendix out, they just go, snip, that's it. You don't even know what happened. That would be cool. Surgery in a higher dimension would transform medicine.
So if you needed to perform a heart surgery, there would be a way to cut through a person through a different dimension, create a perfect incision, replace what you need to replace, but you'd never even cut the body. And when you were talking about those cow surgeries, it sounds like what Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about, this hypothetical dimensional incisions that you could make. And when people talk about Giorgiani talks about how some people think that aliens would be able to communicate to you through your brain, that there are these instances when people start speaking or reciting things that there's no possible way for them to recite, and they believe it's because an alien is projecting or some outer force is projecting into your brain, whispering into your ear something to say. And whether or not a supernatural being can do this, we know for a fact DARPA can do this. They have a voice of God weapon.
It's this idea of things that we're not really supposed to talk to while we're on that field. I just read a book recently, and it was by this guy, and he was talking about consciousness generally. It was this kind of anti-materialistic feeling of like consciousness first and then matter second, and not matter first and consciousness as a result. And that if you think of the world as consciousness first, then things like being able to communicate without speaking can work, right? You just have to have the ability to tap in to that connection. So like, it seems like if somebody's sitting across the table at me, it seems like there's nothing between me and them, but we know as like scientifically aware beings that there's so much in between me and them. There's all sorts of particles, and that's like on a particle level. There's bacteria, and there's dust particles, and there's so much stuff in between me and them that to see it as a vacuum or as a void instead of something that is like physical, right? Like that there's no difference only in the way our matter is kind of optimizing itself, but there's no difference between me and you. There's only quantum particles, right? We are all just quantum particles, different variations of collections of quantum particles. And so if this idea is that you can kind of tap into that connection, right? Then like the idea of ESP or telepathy, things that, as far as ESP, by the way, in this book, it was saying just how many times it's been scientifically verified in studies at like Princeton and Johns Hopkins, and like real places with real people have seen that humans can have an actual effect on a random number generator, more so that is statistically significant. And that they've independently confirmed this over and over and over again. So this they had this really interesting metaphor where they said we're like TVs, right? And we pick up the reception that is consciousness coming out over the loudspeaker, but you would never say that your TV creates the content, right? The TV didn't create the movie. The TV is the vessel for the movie to interact with the universe in, and you require the TV to have any sort of kind of experience of the movie. But it is certainly not the TV that the movie, that this movie comes from. And that if you damage a TV, you will get a damaged, expression of that movie, potentially. So I think it's super obvious that we're going to get there. We're going to get there. We're going to get to warp stuff. I mean, Albuquerque, have you guys, or Albuquerque? I think his name's Albuquerque.
Who's Albuquerque?
1970s, a physicist named Albuquerque theorized that you could, with the mass energy of like Jupiter, where essentially you would move space-time in front of an object and squeeze it out the back, and the act of squeezing the space-time would act kind of like a jet engine with air, that you would like suck in the space-time and the fact, and just the space-time moving behind you would in effect propel you, but you would never move. Only space-time would move in front of or behind the vessel. But it would require just like way too much mass energy. But he proved that it was possible to do it. And then in like 1994, or maybe even potentially a little bit later, maybe it was 94 was Albuquerque, and this is like 2000 and whatever. Look it up. But this physicist was doing something on like the 100 Years of Galileo, and he like decided he was going to do his little talk on this Albuquerque drive, this little known thing. And when he was doing all of his calculations, he found that Albuquerque had done a circular device around his make-believe spaceship, and that if he had done like an oval device around his make-believe spaceship, that you could essentially do it with the mass energy of a Volvo. And that basically you hide within space-time. Space-time moves around you and you never move. So the reason we can't go faster than the speed of light is because actually going that speed is bad for our physiology. And so it would keep us from ever being able to do it. But if we weren't moving, if only space-time was moving around us, then not only is it like possible and able to happen for us as biological beings, but that it would make getting to certain stars like that we know to be interesting and worth checking out like a week, 2 weeks.
Wow, that is crazy. Would it also make us go back in time if we want to?
I think anytime you really start getting into being able to mess with space-time, there is always that sort of possibilities. I don't have the physics robustness to be able to tell you specifically how that relates. You should look at it. Yeah, you definitely go forward. It's really just like essentially you're like sucking in the space-time in the front and spitting it out behind you, and the act of like expanding space-time behind you and contracting it in front of you moves
that actually makes sense to me, because we're always straddling time. So people like to think that they're in the present, but you're actually always simultaneously in the past, present, and future.
Totally.
Right? So we're always straddling time as it's moving. And so it's this illusion that we're living in. And wow, this is deep. This is really good. This is our best one yet by far. I wanted to tie up a potential loose end. When you were talking about simulism, is that Elon Musk's simulism? Is that, or is it a variation on?
Although I would say that the most interesting thinking in simulation theory thought these days is actually the P2P theory. So it's that we're in a blockchain reality, and that we're all actually creating our own simulations simultaneously, and that actually explains all of the known effects of quantum relativity. That like if I'm creating a picture of A and you're creating a picture of A, and everybody else is creating a picture of A, then we have a relativistic nature. Our kind of it's super cool. But yeah, so the general idea of like why we're most likely in a simulation, and I know Elon Musk just says that like if given, he's got a really interesting. He says given any rate of progress on technology, that we will eventually get to a point where we will create a simulation. And then from that point on until the end, the heat death of the universe, that it is likely that at some point in there, we're going to create, infinite amounts of simulations. And if that's the case, then we have to be in one of those simulations. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that we will absolutely create simulations. I think that what's really the most interesting thing about the theory is that it looks to me, at least, like we are going to be the ones that create. Like that, if you had to ask yourself who created this reality that you're living in right now, like who is more likely to have created this specific reality than us? And there is also no other people ever in the history of the universe that have had that we know of, that have had the ability to create a simulation in their time. But as far as I see it, we have the beginnings of blockchain technology, of VR technology, of quantum computing, of AI, of all of the things that we would need to create a simulation. They're all in their kind of infancy right now, just at the same time that we're getting this awareness. And it's like, is that really like a coincidence? Are we having this awareness as to how we're going to get to this place at the same time that we're like coming? It's like, because I don't know that anything happened before my life. I know that it's in history books and everyone says that something happened, but like I have no independent verification that anything happened, frankly, since before yesterday. I woke up this morning and I'm pretty sure that everything that I know has happened, but really it could all really just be a great backstory that they could have loaded up the game today and said, we'd like to start in 2019.
Well, you don't know if there is anything outside of your perceptions, outside of your 5 or 6 senses, as far as whether I'm there or you're there. I think it may be likely that whatever we're projecting right now is a result of all of us wanting it to be here at this moment. And there may not actually be a, how does the phrase goes? If a bear shits in the woods, if nobody's around to see it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if there's nothing there.
Well, to survive the heat death of the universe, we're probably going to need help from the aliens to pierce the veil, and because if it's an endless foam, right? If everything is, I believe in infinity. I think that our minds, we can comprehend just shy of infinity, but I think that the universe or the multiverse, whatever you want to say, is abundant, and that while we might be confined to our corner in the multiverse, that whether it's through some kind of interdimensional highway or wormholing, that as long as we don't cause our own extinction, or as long as we're not swallowed by some bigger fish out there, some kind of scary Leviathan machine civilization like pierces through our universe before we pierce through theirs, I think that life will evolve to survive, and so will information.
It will maximize its future options. Again, I really think it's probably, he doesn't even know it, this guy. I mean, he thinks it's super significant. This Wisner Gross thinks it's super significant, but I don't think he knows exactly how significant what he came up with is. And it's this you can write it on a t-shirt equation. It's I could tell it to you if I had more time to think. I don't want to mess it up, but it's like 6 things. It's like the force of intelligence equals the kind of like the amount of options and the amount of power you have behind searching for those options, and then it's like entropy. So it's this super simple thing, but if you think of everything as of even so, like in order to maximize its future options, if you just have like the Buddhist conception of nothingness, right? This nothingness that exists, which is essentially their God. It's like cannot be described. It can be described and it cannot be described. It is and it isn't. It is nothing. It is all things and it is nothing. It's it's like that thing. Whatever that is very useless. It actually has very few options unless it creates. And in fact, before the nothingness, if you said the only thing that exists is the equation of maximizing your future options, that in order for that to have any meaning, you would need to have a creator. You would need to have the nothingness. And then from the nothingness, you would need to have some emanations that mean something. And from those emanations would, and so forth and so on. But this question of like why is because if the only thing that matters is maximizing future options, and that's it, then it explains everything. It can explain everywhere we've gone, and it explains everywhere we've been. And I think it was super exciting for me to kind of like first put that together for myself, because that's, I feel like, the kind of understanding of the universe that is, and I'm sure it's not complete because I just don't understand all the connections between, but it seems to me that, you know, I'm a big fan of so is above and so is below, that like I really do believe that the reason that we can kind of understand things larger than ourselves and things as abstract as you know, theoretical math and stuff like that is because the world works in a way that is understandable. It works according to some understandable thing. And what we see as chaos is really just our lack of knowledge. It's a lack of information, right? Is chaos to us. And so greater densities of lack of information is actually what we perceive as chaos. But yeah, so that's that. It's formulating these days, but I'm going to write it down soon. As soon as I get in touch with Wisner Gross, I'm going to be like, do you know what it is? But yeah.
Would we be able to in any way connect this as well to morality, to the idea that we all should treat each other like we are one being? Like there is this quote from Henri Bergson: "The universe is a machine for the making of gods." The only downside to that is if we did have all these godlike powers and we were going into different parts of the universe, creating our own simulations and so on and so forth, then I don't know if we'll be nice gods or if we'll be cruel gods, or if we'll figure out that all of the other gods and all of the other things that are being experienced right now are all coming from one source, and whether that has a certain significance to it. The Buddhists, I guess, would say that the significance of that is that everything is nothing and the best state of all to be is extinction, but then why even have this in the first place? Just like some metaphysical game of hide and seek. Like that's the thing that I wouldn't say it bugs me, but I think about it now and again.
It's funny. It goes back to what you guys were saying earlier. Just you know, what's the point, and why have a point? You can either not have a point, or you can have a point. I think as far as morality goes, so my thing that I've been talking about recently with friends is this phrase, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you," right? Is the old school thing. I would posit that we are way too terrible for that to be the rule, and we're way too what's the word, masochistic, for that really truly to be the rule. That if you say, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," it's very easy to kind of come back at that with like, "Well, I wouldn't have minded," right? Like I think that's like where you get all this like identity politics freak outs, is like everybody kind of believing that they want them to treat others the way they would want to be treated in some way, right? Like, and so people are like, "I wouldn't care if you said something insensitive to me," and other people are like, "Everybody should care the most about being insensitive," and it's like, all right, you get it. But if you say, and try this, "Do unto others as would create maximal happiness for them," right? Do unto others that which will give them maximal amounts of happiness, or that will which create maximal amounts of opportunities for them, or whatever. But if you really take it back and swing it back to the person, because I think that's what we're missing, which is like, it does require some thoughts. There's no way of just saying it's super easy to be moralistic. Like, it's not. It actually requires some thought. But that is how we, the human animal, have distinguished ourselves in our history, is that we put the thought into thinking about, well, would somebody like this, right? Like lions don't think about morality, which is interesting because they neither are kind of responsible for morality because they don't think about it, but they also don't really care about it. They just go and they fucking eat baby zebras like all day long.
But amongst each other, you know, different animals have different social behaviors. I like bonobos, I think, are a lot more moral to each other than chimps are to each other, where you hear these horrible stories of chimps, you know, like maiming each other just for, you know, figuring out the pecking order.
We're both of them. We're made up of, we're like half bonobo, half chimp, right? Like, isn't that the concept?
Yes.
Half of us, we just want to fuck all the time, and then chimps, we just want to kill each other.
No.
And that's super cool. I don't think that that's necessarily morals as much as it's an evolutionary maximizing of options.
Well, because vegans will, because when you're trying to, if we're like Schopenhauer trying to talk about morality and saying, well, animals are suffering all over the world everywhere and things are eating and being eaten, and vegans are going to say, well, people should lead by example and stop eating meat. And, and we'll figure out how to deal with the billions of other life forms or trillions of other life forms, and how they're organizing. I think in the long run, if we can create lab grown meats and if they're indistinguishable from animals, there's no reason why people shouldn't aspire to stop killing things altogether, like Vash the Stampede and Trigun. But, I think that people can't disregard, the natural order of the universe, that there are things, that things work in certain ways. And so, is it immoral to eat fish? I don't think so. But I really love how Native Americans would give thanks for, if they were very spiritually in touch with the spirit of nature. And so it wasn't like this maniacal, malevolent, like they would try to, kill their hunt, painlessly, quickly, and then they'd use the whole animal, right? And then they would give thanks for it, and they were grateful for their life. And I think that there's something there where you see some of this industrialized food industry. I can see the horror of vegans when I've seen these videos of people in a cattle farm, just abusing these poor animals, and it really it hurts your soul. It's awful and disturbing, and I can see how why we should want to create a more efficient way to feed everyone in a more humane way. But also, it's like, for me, like, I think it's like I gotta prioritize people over other animals. Do you know what I mean? It's just like that's my blood, those are my neighbors, that's my family, is the human race, and so we gotta eat to live, and until we're, augmented so we can live on photosynthesis, I think it's important not to self-loathe yourself for living.
You have to set it. So my girlfriend is a vegetarian, but we had a day where I left some fruit in, and we left for a little while, and we came back, there was fruit flies all over the kitchen, right? And she went on a fucking fruit fly genocide. I mean, just like 25 flies lost their lives in like the span of like 5 minutes.
Rest in peace.
Looking at her like how is it that you have this double standard of life, right? Like that, like these little fruit flies. Now, granted, you relatively cut short a shorter life, but there's this. We are about killing things, very much like we are about gentrification, which is like, nobody cares when the bulletproof glass is coming off the bodega. Like, no one says a goddamn thing. But if you get rid of an artisanal chocolate place, people will lose their minds. They will just go out of there. They'll start protesting, and there will be handboards. And it's like, so like, where is at what point is it okay? At what point is it not okay? And these are kind of, I think the most satisfying concept that I've ever gotten about these questions, it kind of comes back down to Taoism, which is just this idea that it's in constant flux, right? And I think that that's actually a really good lesson to learn about all lessons, and about all lessons that we try to kind of provide answers for, which is that at every point we like provide an answer and we move a little bit further, but then you have to take new stock of the question from this point. And then you make another choice, and then you hit here. But then you have to make another independent verification of your like positioning from the next point. But oftentimes I think a great example of this is how we are dealing with Russia, right? Like, so my dad's generation politically hates Russia because he's from, the Reagan administration, and and back then it was, they were the evil empire, and there was like food lines and the whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so they have this feeling about Russia, like from that. And then young people, like, who don't remember that way our parents felt about Russia, we only know about Russia from like Pussy Riot. And we're like, they put ladies in jail. Like, they're terrible. They're terrible people. But like, actually, like, liberals used to fucking paper their rooms with, you know, hammers and sickles, and conservatives used to hate Russia with all of its might. And so now we got this whole thing where like both sides are like, wait, I don't know how I feel about this Russia thing. Am I on the same side as a conservative? Like, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that. And that's why kind of everybody got up on Trump's business with this whole Russia thing. But the truth of the matter is that if you take stock today and you ask yourself, how is Russia? Forget about how we felt about Russia 25 years ago and forget about what they did to Pussy Riot. Let's just take like stock independently about where Russia is. Russia is a massive country that is old school European culture that abuts China, right? Which in 1985, when I was born, China was maybe what, like 5th or 6th or 7th in world power. And they are solidly second, competing for first now, right? So this whole idea of like where we got NATO from when we were like, all right, so it's us and Europe against Russia and some other people, right? And Russia and China, it doesn't even matter because they're both communists, but they're both poor. And we're going to be with Europe and we're both rich and we're, you know, like we're Democrat and everything's great. But now we've got a whole new situation. We've got Russia, which is not bread lines and gulags anymore. Russia is, you know, Benetton and Louis Vuitton. Like it's a capitalist, you know, shithole. In like we're a capitalist shithole, but like we're just a capitalist. We put journalists in jail. We, you know, send people down to Guantanamo. We kill.
Oh, there's I do want to interject a bit. There's a slight difference though. I'm originally from Russia. I was born in St. Petersburg and I came here when I was around 4 years old. And I still keep in touch with some of the people there, like this really famous guy in St. Petersburg, Alexander Nevzorov, who was one of the first people to be a journalist in Russia, had his own TV show right after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Wow.
Anyway, as far as what's going on in Russia right now, a lot of what you're saying is definitely on point as far as it being like a capitalist shithole country. But as far as the situations that are going on in America, and like we have things like Michael Hastings and a lot of really iffy situations going on here. But in Russia, they do a lot of stuff in public as far as poisoning people. Let's say if you're talking about a defector from Russia to America who had some things. Let me rephrase that.
Not a defector anymore. You can just get on a plane and come over and stay.
That's true.
You know, like I'm not saying that they're not bad. I'm just saying that like we have to stop thinking of us as the good guys and them as the bad guys, because that's a narrative that worked in 1985, and it is not the present reality. They could be worse guys, right? Like, and that's like, but like on a relative measure. Like they're just
definitely. Well, we got to deal with situations as they come instead of thinking that Russia is going to invade the next country. If Russia starts to invade the next country, absolutely, that's going to be something that, unfortunately,
but I don't even
NATO's going to have to deal with.
I don't even care what Russia decides to do, because to be honest, like, so they had the Soviet, like they are a revisionist power. They come from an empire that is thousands of years old, right? Like, so they think about the world from a dynasty standpoint. Like they are, when you're a leader of Russia, you're looking back over thousands of years of history, right? And you're making moves with that kind of scale in mind. And same with China, by the way. And the thing that we have to worry about with China is that China, first off, they're going to take Taiwan imminently. And then my feeling is in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see moves on Japan. They hate Japan. And the last thing that we got from Japan and China was the rape of Nanking. It did not go well for China. And China has been looking since that time to, you know, even the playing field a little bit. And they're going to get to a point where the question is, when they do something to Japan, who do we want to be allied with? Do we want to be allied with Europe, or do we want to be allied with Russia? Because I would rather be best friends with Russia when it comes time to a Chinese expansion, because that is a balance, right? Like you can't just make the same balance that worked in 1985 and expect it to work today. This is about like taking stock today and being like, all right, we were always making a little bit of a devil's bargain. That is what politics and international relations and all that bullshit kind of tends to be. But like, we have to be very real about who the actual threat is. And I don't think it's Russia personally. That's what I'm saying is I think that like, listen, we do deals with Saudi Arabia and we do deals with a whole bunch of terrible people. The question always has to be, what are we actually trying to accomplish? And I think that we have to take a new look at the stage. And frankly, if Russia wanted to take Ukraine back, that would be up to Russia as far as I'm concerned. We literally took every ounce of our land. We took it by killing either Mexicans or Native Americans. So like, we have absolutely no actual claim to our land. Yeah, I mean, we literally just came here and we massacred millions and millions of people to take this land. And we act like we've had it forever and it's ours and we have it like from some sort of legitimate. We don't.
Well, the Aztecs were, but a lot of these stories about, when we came over here, it's like they were all. Is that where the term noble savage comes from? Like they were doing some pretty gruesome things that it wasn't. I'm not just trying to wash it over, but they were very, very, very violent, gruesome.
Yeah, I mean, they were tribal.
Same
with Africa. You could make the same statement, which is like, listen, we went in there, like they weren't doing anything. They were hanging out around like campfires, and like we were building castles and cities and things like that. And kind of that's what happens when you're like the last one in. You get kind of the shit position, and
it's never a perfect situation. You're absolutely right. If things are going to happen with China, that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with, and maybe Russia would be a good ally there. At the same time, though, as far as the shit that people have to deal with in Russia, they have this program, which is kind of like a Make-A-Wish Foundation type thing. Putin sits in his desk, and then he has people to request, my landlord doesn't want me to stay in my apartment anymore. And Putin takes a phone and calls up the landlord and says, Mr. Landlord, you better give this Boris or Natasha back her place. And the landlord says, yes, sir. And it's done. But the whole thing is an illusion. It basically shows Putin as being this godlike daddy figure who gives people what they need. Meanwhile, the country itself is extremely corrupt. Nobody wants to do business in Russia because if your business is successful, it gets taken away by Putin's cronies. Like this one dude who was driving an Uber, he was telling me about how he used to have a vodka business, a distillery, and how one day he came to work and it was taken from him by one of Putin's friends, and that's it. He couldn't do anything about it. His family's still in Russia while he's here trying to make some money for them. So it's an unfortunate thing. And again, I could see how there could be certain situations where, much like we allied with countries like Saudi Arabia, which we don't really agree with as far as certain moral things go. For me, it's still difficult to talk about this stuff relating to Ukraine. Like I know people over there who are having a lot of troubles with the Russians and with the wars that are going on there. And the whole thing sucks. All I can hope for is that Russia frees itself from this psychological domination, because I think it's psychological as well. A lot of Russian people, for the longest time, you could go back to Rurik, who was considered to be one of the founders of Russia. He was like a Swede or Norwegian. He wasn't Russian. And we actually did an episode about this with Jules, where I talked about how pretty much all the people who ruled Russia up until recently, they weren't native Russians. They were Europeans. They were like Catherine the Great. She was a German princess. They were people who were also working in the earlier days on behalf of the Golden Horde, the Mongolians. And they were basically stealing the produce that the peasants made and burning down the villages that didn't comply with their demands. And those people were canonized later on as these heroes of ancient Russia. So the only point here is that this mentality that the Russians have had for a long time, especially most of them being serfs, most of them being treated like farm animals by the nobility for a long time, that does something to your brain. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of that vile evilness came out during the Stalinist times, when a lot of those former serfs, I mean generations afterwards, they still had that mentality, and they were doing untold cruelty to the people who were in these in these concentration camps and these gulags. So that's why that particular kind of evil, I want to keep at bay as much as possible. And the only way to do that, I think, isn't to go to war with Russia, but it's to do something to enable the Russian people to get out of that mentality and for there to be much better investment in Russia where there's not going to be that much corruption.
Well, the internet, I jokingly like to call it Gutenberg Press too. In blockchain technologies, these new technologies of trust and increased transparency, I think that culture, I've said this before, culture is the battleground and politics is the formality. So it's the same reason why Netanyahu will appeal to the inhabitants of the citizens of Iran and say, listen, we don't like your leadership. We want to help you. And the first step is with information.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're the best we can hope for is to give that information. The best we can hope for is to educate people all around the world. I think that borders are going to start being a lot less, first off, I'm a philosopher king kind of person. So my like ideal government is a smart dictator. Which is why I'm like not so against kind of like dictators, like, because you got to understand is if you're in charge, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't like what you're doing. There's always going to be someone. And then the question has to become like, what do you do? Right? Like if I put you in charge of the world and there was a guy who swore that everything that Jules did was wrong, and that like not only was it wrong, but it was like it was going to ruin the world and the world was going to end and you were the actual devil. Like, how do you deal with that person? And I think that, various leaders have dealt with them in different ways. But even in America, when somebody wants to down with America, we send them off to fucking Guantanamo. It's like there's not so many ways that you deal with people that are trying to stop you from, kind of achieving your goals. We just happen to do it with a bunch of people that act like 365 of them are controlling the world, or 435.
Well, the thing we have going for us, though, is I think America and also Switzerland, as far as I was reading in Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, has that quality of anti-fragility, where we have a lot of these different states and a lot of these counties within the states and a lot of different communities within those counties that are making various decisions on a daily basis. And also, luckily, we have a lot of lawyers here in America who, for all the bad things lawyers do, are still the kind of middlemen that would make sure, like, even with all the terrorists that go to Guantanamo, they still get legal representation. Like, sure, we have black sites and horrible things like that, but relative to the things that are going on otherwise, like, we can definitely look at all the bad things, but we have to be very grateful, I think, for us not having a top-down type system where whatever the...
But you don't think that... You don't think that when the CIA makes a designation about what it needs to either do with a person or to a person or for a person, you don't think that they get that done by whatever means are necessary?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
That everyone else
is an interesting point. That's an interesting point. Well, but that's the same reason why I'm very skeptical of the philosopher king. And though I don't want to be naive and say that there aren't instances when it's better to have a gun and not need one than to need a gun and not have one. It's just, that I really appreciate and am grateful that America is the Texas of the world, right? And that like we're able to have conversations like this. And I think the checks and balances that are in our system are essential, and that there's no, and it's the same reason why I believe in decentralization over centralization is that, and we were talking about nothingness earlier. The reason why there is something rather than nothing is because nothing is unstable and things emerge from nothing that previously didn't exist. And so the reason why I when trying to understand the natural order of the universe from a Hayekian perspective or a Spinoza perspective, and why I'm excited by innovations with the internet and blockchain is people's ability to crowdsource and decentralize, that you don't need, benevolent dictators or one philosopher king, but you can have many role models leading by example, contributing to make the world a better place, and that it doesn't have to, and that we don't need to depend on illegitimate authority. That authority is earned, and authority should always be questioned. And I think that if you have that perspective and mindset of, following, because laws can be very arbitrary. So I am a big believer in replacing rule of law with the rule of authority. That's like a libertarian idea, but it's because that people are better at codifying each other's behavior than we are at legalizing morality, right? Like the reason why Jeff Bezos increased the wage for his employees is not because we passed a law, it was because Bernie Sanders started shaming him. And now the groundswell on social media, people started chiming up and saying, hey, we don't like what you're doing. And he took the hint and made the adjustment.
So that's, and by the way, I mean, kind of what you just said though proves my point, right? Which is that that the proper, nobody made Bezos do that. They just suggested politely in the right way, and he did. But that is what he is, a benevolent dictator.
Of his own. I see what you're saying.
But thus is the world. Let me just tell you, if they asked me if I would hand the keys to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, I would hand the entire world's keys to either of those men, and I would say, it's yours. All of the militaries, all of the governments, all of the people, I'm giving you control of them. And I think they would do a much better job as kings of this world than our current government. So any governmental system on earth.
But then they'll have kids, and those kids would not be as smart as them. And who's going to get those kids out of there?
I'm not sure if I would give them the keys to the whole world. I think that might be jumping the gun a little bit, but
we don't let CEOs just hand off the job to their kids. I mean, sometimes they do, but if you looked at a philosopher king position as more of a CEO position and less of a monarch, then there's ways not only to check their power, as we do in all businesses, but there are ways to kind of ensure a stable transition. So I just don't think that there's not a model for how we do this the right way.
Well, checking the power, that's the most important thing to me. I mean, I'm definitely open to the idea that something like this could potentially work. I just don't want to have things happen like going back to Russia again. There was a story about this old man who did a comment on Facebook criticizing some aspect of the government, and he got arrested for it. He was sitting in trial, and it was pretty horrible. Like, this is like a 70-something-year-old man who happened to have wrong think about a certain policy. And that kind of stuff scares me. And the black sites that you mentioned and the CIA and all the bad things they're up to, that also scares me. And I also want to create a world where people aren't going to be as dependent on having forces like that to interject and do some shadowy stuff. I would rather have a lot of things in the open. And but the only problem is that it's difficult for me to criticize America right now when I see something like that happening to an old man in Russia. Like, I have to pick the best out of the worst, and I don't see any other way right now other than working with that with the idea of picking something better in mind later on.
Well, what I'm saying is that we are neither the best nor the worst. That neither Russia or America are the worst, and we're not the best. But
it's very humbling.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, I think that,
I think America's the best. I'm going to go out. I'm going to say.
I grew up. I'm a Star Spangled. I grew up with a family of Republicans, and kind of in the midst of the Reagan era. This was all about American exceptionalism and our path towards leading the world towards a moral future. And I think that takes an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance to truly embrace. It's a fantastic in the same way that, when you're teaching different levels of understanding, when you're teaching kids about something, you have to give it to them in a simpler way of understanding. And so you can't say to kids, we're kind of in the middle. We do good things and we do bad things. You got to kind of be like, we're the best and America is great. And the things that we stand for, which is like hope and
you add
freedom and all that
context.
stuff, super important. Because like that's the narrative. That has to be the narrative, because in the same way that we were talking in the very, very beginning, establishing the narrative, establishing the dream and the goal and the what you want to be helps you actually get to be that person.
Absolutely. Well, perhaps places like Norway could be qualified as the best as far as the way the people live and respect each other, but it's a small place. It's very homogeneous, not a lot of people there, different history. And it's difficult for me to take the idea of Norway or Denmark and to transpose that on a giant country with as much responsibilities as America. But what I think makes America, if not great, then something that strives to be great, are people like you and others who criticize the various things that need to be improved upon in this country, where we're not just living off of a certain supply of oil and being all happy-dappy, but we are going through these obstacles that are being thrown at us, and we're answering them, and we're doing something about them.
When I say America is the best, it's not from a nationalist perspective. It's from like an eternal idea perspective. Is I think what America represents. You could say it's a pinnacle of Western culture. I like trying to think in terms of a more Eastern and Western yin yang, like an Atlantean culture, one that aspires to manifest its destiny and that believes the future can be better than the present. And I think America, its emphasis on freedom and inalienable rights is unparalleled as far as my awareness goes.
Well, so you could say that America is striving to be good, and that we strive to be good at a level that nobody else seems to. Although, again, I think that's then the question becomes, do we strive to be good in the same way that Norway strives to be good? We certainly are faced with more challenges. And so, there's an interesting, in Judaism, there's an interesting thought about how heaven works. So, right, like we don't have a heaven per se. The way we define heaven is based on our own potential in the world and how we kind of dealt with how we reached or did not reach that potential. We are that distance away from God in the eternal kind of basketball game that is God. We are either in the floor seats, or we're way up in the thing, or we're outside the stadium watching it on TV. That the kind of proximity to God is our heaven or hell. That like being far away from God forever would be hell, and close would be thing. But I like that, which is that like you're never. First off, you can't compare. It's not you compared to Rashi, and it's not me compared to Mother Teresa. It's me compared to me. That is how that my final goal will look. And one of the first books that I read when I was really young in the political science realm was Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And if you haven't read it, it's for a book written in I think the mid 1700s. It's so well, so understandable, and it's just this French dude who came to America and was basically like, this place is perfect for democracy. Like it's not only just are the people perfect for democracy, but there's actual physical demographic things. There's geography that has contributed to its excellence in this experiment that is democracy. And I think that I still believe that. I still believe that this giant country with all, from deserts to rainforests to, temperate forests and mountains and oceans and spanning 2 oceans. And we have the possibility of being so great. And hopefully we're striving towards that, and hopefully we'll reach it. But I think that we're all just basically, we're middling, 7-year-olds in the ultimate, kind of place that we want to be as humans. And I think that we're going to look back. I think that, I think that's part of looking at how we're going to treat meat. I do think that we're going to look back and be embarrassed as to how we treated animals for a really long time. And I think that, so we'll eventually get there. But I also just believe in this kind of it's the constant, the reason that humans have the potential to be great And the reason that we have a greater potential than angels is because we actually have to fight against something. We have to, it takes something to be a good human. It doesn't take anything to be a good angel. That's why we were more important to God than the angels.
That's a good point, and it reminds me in Buddhism when they were talking about how the gods themselves are jealous of human beings because the gods have too much fantastic stuff that they could occupy their time with. They don't really know what it's like to struggle, to have suffering in your life.
Yeah.
So in that way, this limited state that we're in right now, it may be a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, you truly can't understand happiness until you understand suffering. It's this. They call it a theodicy, right? Like is your philosophical understanding of why evil and badness exists in the universe and why it has to. And I think that it's super simple. That it makes everything else more interesting. That you can't have one without the other.
That was really well said. And with that, I think that we should wrap it up right now. But thank you so much, Zac. It was an honor and a pleasure to have you here. Where could people find you?
Ooh, I try to stay hidden, but actually, if you look for me on Instagram, it's at the Dandelion King. So that's the dandelion is in the flower king. It's a very long story, and I'm sorry I sound like I still have an AOL screen name, but it's you can find me there or teaching at Parsons. So if you happen to be a senior at Parsons next semester, you'll find me teaching the Navigating the Field course.
Oh, nice. And what is that course about?
It's about how to navigate the world after college.
That's something that they need to put in every college or probably every high school before they even go into college. So hopefully there's going to be a lot more of that. Well, thank you very much. And guys, it's been a pleasure as always. Please like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to click that bell for more updates. We'll see you soon.